Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Baron of Dice, premium wargaming dice. Over 500 styles, over 4,000 customer reviews. Welcome to the best dice on the planet.
With my Dwarf Army finished for the old world, waiting for the release for a few extra bits, I've been going down a little bit of a different nostalgic path this week. So I thought, let's do a little extra unplanned tutorial.
And if you haven't already guessed it, yes, I'm old. And when I first played Warhammer 40,000, it was during Rogue Trader. And while my first main wargaming love was Warhammer Fantasy, I soon discovered the wonderful world of Warhammer 40,000 as well. And when I say played, that was probably a bit of a stretch of a description. I was a near teen or a young teen when I first discovered Warhammer, and it was probably not until 40k's second edition that I played regular games. But that didn't stop me collecting and painting a little bit and even playing the odd small game. And look at the contents of this Warhammer 40k compendium, a mix of White Dwarf articles containing the list for the Imperial Guard army, which I believe, if memory serves me correctly, was my first ever army. But I'll halt the personal old hammer history there and maybe save that for another video, maybe even as part of a series related to this one. But the topic of this video will be painting a Commissar for the first time in about 30 years or so. Of course, when I first encountered Commissars, they looked like this and then like this. But I really love this latest sculpt, the standard Commissar, I believe, in the range at the moment, the new Astra Militarum range. I thought, I love the pose, I love the miniature. It's been something that's been on my to-do list for a little while. Now, first off, I have primed the miniature black. That seems to be common with so many of us wargamers these days. And then I'm using some Two Thin Coats Death Reaper, which is nearly black. It's a very, very dark grey. And I'm using the airbrush for this stage. I'm giving it the most subtle of top-down dustings, just to add a little bit of extra value. It means that the darker black from the prime is left there in the recesses, and it just gives this slightly matted black look, which will give a little bit more depth overall. And then staying with the Two Thin Coats range, I'm using Cold Corpse Blue, Wolf Grey and Gravestone, and they form part of a little triad within that series. I'm starting with the Cold Corpse Blue. Again, I'm just following up as I did before at the very, very slightest of airbrush layers, this time focusing towards the bottom of the cape and then the very tops of his shoulders and on the top of his hat. Very, very subtle, very little there, and just to give me a little bit of a highlight before I start going in with a brush. Now, if you're not an airbrush user, don't panic. This is the last time I'll be using an airbrush, and you can complete the rest of this tutorial, I suppose, just by copying the rest of the stages with the hairy brush. I hope you can see it there on camera. It's always easy to see with the naked eye, but it still looks like he's got a black cloak on, but I've just got a little bit of grey highlight built in there. And what I'm just doing here, again, I said no more airbrushing. It was a little lie. I'm just saving myself some time later on, and I'm putting a little bit of lighter grey on the rock and around his boots. Well, I'll come back and explain why I did that on his boots a little later on. What I'm doing here is still using that Cold Corpse Blue, which is the darkest tone in that little triad, and giving some subtle edge highlights here. So a little bit on the palette, a tiny bit of water to keep it moving nice and smoothly, a very tiny little bit on a good point on a brush. This is a size 2 brush, but it's relatively well looked after and has a decent point. I'm just going around the edges or going around where the fabric is raised and putting the most subtle little highlight I can. And this is probably the most tricky part of the whole paint job, is how to highlight black. If you overdo it, it looks grey. If the lines are too thick, it can look a little bit messy. So I'm taking my time here, working my way around, finding all those little folds in the cloth where it's a little bit raised, and using the detail of the miniature. The stages with the airbrush have helped a little bit because I've picked out those highlighted areas and made them easier to see. But you can see I'm just following around. I've turned the miniature upside down, using the edge of my brush to try and keep those lines as thin as possible. Exactly the same at the back of the miniature as well, working on those lines, trying not to make them too thick and just accentuating what's already there. By now we're moving on to the wolf grey, which is the mid-tone, and we're kind of retracing our steps a little bit, but not covering those full lines. You're still leaving some of the cold quartz blue showing, trying to make the lines a little bit thinner or just placed in the most raised areas. And then as we get further down the line, we're using the gravestone blue, which is the top highlight. And here I am focusing much smaller marks just at the very highest points where the light catches. And as we get to the front of the miniature and these most visible, most bold creases, I'm actually using little dots rather than a solid line. Not only does it show the previous layers through, it also gives the feeling of texture of this black leather. If you want it to be leather, in my mind it's a kind of a big leather cloak. It just helps it look like scratches, make it worn, and again just help you can control those lines a little bit. Staying with the gravestone blue here, I'm actually adding the odd little scratch along the bottom where it will be caught along rocks and things like that. And once I've finished all those highlights, I just add 2 parts water to 1 part Death Reaper, which is that very, very darkest layer we did for that first dry brush stage. And I'll just glaze it over the top. And what this does, it just knocks back those brightest highlights a little bit so they don't look too white or greyish, and it just ties it all in together. If you're not used to glazing, glazing is a technique, though you can buy pre-made glazes, and Games Workshop definitely used to sell them. So what you're trying to do here is you're not using it like a wash. You're not trying to get it to settle in the recesses. You're trying to give one really thin coat over the whole area that you're applying it to. In this case, pretty much all of the black cloak, and it just slightly dulls and tints the layers that are below it. And of course, if you like playing war games, and particularly Warhammer 40,000, you need dice. So please forgive me while I quickly plug the channel's sponsor and sponsor of this video, Baron of Dice. As you can see, they make lots of amazing custom dice with the theme of Imperial Guard or Astra Militarum maybe, or maybe lots of other 40k style armies or dice themes. If you like their dice, do check them out using the link in the video description, and you can use Miniature Realms for an extra 5% off. And anyway, back to the painting. Now we have some German camo medium brown, flat earth and tan earth. Now these are all from model color from Vallejo, and we're going to be working on the leather areas on the miniature, at least the holster and the leather strap. So we're starting with German camo medium brown with a nice thin layer all over the belt area. And then after that we're moving to flat earth, and we're covering most of the belt and holsters still here, leaving a little bit of that German camo medium brown showing underneath, so you're building up the layers. For the final highlight layer, we're using the tan earth, and here I'm focusing very much towards the edges on the raised areas around the top of the belt and towards the bottom and the buckle areas, like that traditional GW style edge highlighting really. Continue working my way around the leather areas, a nice thin line towards the top and the bottom of the belt. I like to keep this final layer of paint fairly thin, so probably 2 parts paint to 1 part water at least. I'd rather go back and do a second line than have something too thick. And then just at the end, just to add a few final touches, the odd little diagonal scratch mark or something like that really helps make leather look a little bit more leather-like. Now this is Garagak Sewer contrast paint. Now I quite often paint my miniatures using a zenithal underpainting method, and this becomes my base coat for my leathers, and then I tend to use the colours you've already seen on top, but I'm doing it a little bit in reverse here. I do like the rich colour that the Garagak Sewer gives, so what I'm doing here is I'm glazing it into the centre of the leather panels a little bit, just to add some further depth. Because I've thinned it with some water by 50-50, if I did go over the other edges, the final highlights and things, they're still showing through, so it's a bit like the glaze that we used on the black overcoat as well. Again, so it just ties it all down, adds extra depth into the middle, but knocks back those top highlights a little bit as well. Staying with the contrast paint, we have Sigor Brown, which is a nice, rich, reddish brown, but not too bright, so not on the sort of the orange scale, more on the deeper red scale. And I'm actually painting this directly over his boots, and this is partly why I went back earlier on with the grey in the airbrush still and just lightened up those boots, because by using a contrast paint over a greyer surface, an underpainted surface, you do get a little bit of highlight showing through, which will help me with the next stage when I highlight these boots, because it gives me the outline and also gives me a starting point. So we're going back to Vallejo model colour here, and we have Hull Red and German Camo Pale Brown. And again, this is a combination I use a lot. My own little triad here with the Seigel Brown as the base and the Hull Red as the mid-tone and the German Camo Pale Brown as the top. So we're on that mid-tone stage at the moment using the Hull Red. It looks very bright when it first goes on, but I'm just focusing across the top of the front of the shoe here, picking out those raised areas, and you start to get this kind of buffed reddish leather look. For this second stage here, I've actually mixed in a little bit of the German Camo Pale Brown into the Hull Red, just to add a little bit of a mid-tone again on the front of those boots. So an extra level in there means that with the Seigel Brown, you're on to the third highlight at this stage. And then to add that top highlight, just some really thin lines of that German Camo Pale Brown towards the edges. Then much like before, I've made a little bit of a glaze with that base colour, which is that Seigel Brown, on the wet palette, added some water, about 50-50 again, and just a nice thin coat over the whole boot, and it just ties all of those highlight levels together, knocks back the brightest points. So we return to Duncan Rhodes, painting Academy's Two Thin Coats range, and we have Berserker Red, Sanguine Scarlet and Demon Red, and we're using these like a traditional triad here. So we're starting with the Berserker Red. We have a little bit of red around the cap, and then we have red on the inside of his collar as well. And then we have some red on his cuffs as well. Now, because there's a little bit of armour on the outside of these cuffs, the only red showing is in towards the belt and in towards the big coat. So you want to be careful that you don't get red paint on those now that you've finished those areas. If I do get a little splash on there, I tend to wash my brush off really quickly and use the clean brush to take it back off again. After that initial layer, we go in with the Sanguine Scarlet, and that really starts to make the red stand out. This is much more vibrant and bright here, and it starts to look much more like a traditional red colour that you'd expect. As this is very standard style highlighting using layers, we want to make sure that we're leaving some of that Berserker Red showing as well, but moving towards the top areas with that Sanguine Scarlet. And for the very, very top highlight, we're using the Demon Red, and on the top of the hat here, I'm just doing the faintest of lines so the other two colours still show through. Then we're repeating that process on the other areas, so just at the top of the inside cuffs here where the light might catch, and then just at the bottom where it's a little bit more visible, really just adds this nice variation and makes it pop. Staying with the Two Thin Coats range, I'm moving now on to Argonaut Skin, Kronos Flesh and Ares Flesh, which is one of the skin triads from the range, but I'm starting with Druid Flesh, which is the shade, the darkest tone in another one of the triads, one for darker skin, just because I believe it'll give me a little bit more depth to start with, and I'm just working a nice thin layer over all the flesh areas. And before we get stuck into that main triad, I'm going to be using some Vallejo Express colour, Deep Purple and Gloomy Violet. That's their own contrast style range. And first of all, I'm using the Gloomy Violet just to add a little bit of shadow around the top of the hand where it meets the cuff, but then also in the eye sockets or where the peak of his cap is causing a shadow. And then after that, I'm using a little bit of Deep Purple, which is much more red in tone, and it just adds a little bit of warmth, and it's great around the nose and around the bottom of the chin, and we'll come back and use those again later. So back to that triad that we saw at the beginning of this little section, so the Argonaut Skin, the Kronos Flesh and the Ares Flesh. I'm going to use them like a traditional triad now, building up via layers. So starting with the Argonaut Skin, focusing on the tops of the fingers and across the lines where the tendons are on the hand and across the knuckle. And then you just build up by layers, so following the same areas with Kronos Flesh, leaving a little bit of the previous layers showing. And it's much the same with the face. We're going in with that Argonaut Skin first, making sure that we're focusing on the cheekbones, the bridge of the nose, around the chin, focusing on those raised areas, leaving the shadow that's already there. building up with the Kronos flesh afterwards, and then adding the Ares flesh as the very slightest top highlight, so tips of the nose, right on the edge of the cheekbones, and so on. You can see here towards these final stages, the Ares flesh is really adding a nice bright top highlight. And then afterwards, to tie it all in, I'm using a little bit of that deep purple, which is that reddish of the express colors from Vallejo. I'm just thin that with water, almost 50-50, and just applying it back around the lips and the bottom half of the cheeks. And it really just ties it all back in together and adds a bit of warmth back. Now we're ripping through this miniature at the moment, and we're moving on to metallics, and we have a black metal from Scale Colour and Game Air Silver from Vallejo. Now the Game Air Silver is a really nice smooth silver, but works really well with the hairy brush. Not all air paints do, but most do, so don't be put off by the air label. And they're very, very smooth, low in the thickness of the flakes for the metal, which is what a lot of metallic paints use, and sometimes when they're very grainy it's because they're not smooth enough, and I much prefer the smoother paints. Here we are using the black metal from the Scale Colour range, and while it's a little bit more viscous, it thins very, very nicely, but it is also ultra smooth and really, really nice to use. So if you haven't tried them already, I definitely recommend them. So I'm just working my way around all of these metal areas. So we have the breastplate, there's a back plate, shoulder guards, and the sort of gauntlets around the wrists. Once that black metal is down, we're using that Game Air Silver, and I'm just focusing on the higher areas, cleaning my brush, and then just feathering or blending it out. Very much the same at the front, but there is the Commissar emblem across his chest, which we're going to be painting a different colour, so it doesn't matter too much if you get another paint on it. For the end of the chainsaw, I'm actually dry brushing on that Game Air Silver. It's so smooth that it goes on very, very nicely, and I can get a really nice transition with these super soft dry brushes. So sticking with metallics and sticking with Scale Colour range, we've got Viking Gold and Elven Gold. Viking Gold first is just a base layer to the emblems on the chest, across the top of the cap, and the smaller one on the side of the chainsword. Once that is dry, you go back with the Elven Gold, and I'm focusing towards the top of those emblems here, and again blending it down a little bit like I did with the Game Air Silver, leaving the Viking Gold underneath. Of course, repeating that on the emblem on the cap and on the side of the chain blade. And now it's time to add a little bit of a wash to those metallics, and I'm going to use a ready mixed oil, and this is Soilworks grease from Scale Colour. Now if you haven't used oils before, they work very much like a standard wash, but the beauty of them is that they run into all the crevices and don't pool so much on the flat surfaces, and then once they're dry you can actually clean them back away using a little bit of Artist White Spirits, so you don't have that problem that you do with a non-oil or an Agrax shade. You get it in the wrong place and it dries all funny, and then when they do dry they look a lot more matte and they look like they've weathered the area as well, so they shade and weather all at the same time. I just love them, and they are my go-to most of the time for washes. So I'm working my way around all of the metallic areas on the miniature, adding the oil wash. Now I'm being relatively careful here, allowing it to run into all the detail and the crevices. Some people will call it a pin wash, and it just means that you're allowing it to run into the detail and not sit on the flat surfaces. I could just slap it on all over because you have the ability to clean it up and take it away, but I'm trying to be a little bit careful because I'm trying to keep it off the areas of the miniature that aren't metallics at this point. I am using a little bit of oil wash here just on the bottom of the cape, and I am allowing it to pool. And what will happen is it will evaporate and leave some dry staining at the bottom, which will look perfect for a little bit of dry dust and mud and things. And then once those oils have dried, and they'll be touch dry within half an hour or so on a miniature like this, even less if you pop a hairdryer on it, just using a little bit of Artist White Spirit. You can use Sansador as well on the end of an old brush, and I'm just taking it off those flat surfaces, and it just turns it back to shiny, leaving it into those recesses. And you don't have the ability to do this if you're using something like an Agrax shade. Now obviously things like white spirit can strip paint, and if you're using this in large amounts, a lot of people do on tanks and things, you often want to protect the miniature first with a gloss varnish and then matte again afterwards. You don't really need to do that when you're doing in such a small area here, and most metallic paints are fairly robust, so you'll find you get away with it no problem at all. And before you know it, we're at the end of the miniature. I'm just adding a little bit of blood for the blood god onto that chain blade, because why wouldn't you? It's 40k and it's a gruesome weapon. I find with this effect, it's always a little bit is less is more. You can splodge some on, wet your brush a little bit and just sort of blend it out and it looks fantastic. But I couldn't resist putting some on the base as well. And there we have one finished Commissar, and I really did have a lot of fun painting this. And I can't remember the last time I painted one, but I was definitely before I'd left school, and that was a number of years ago. And I really love this miniature, and a new project idea has given me the push to finally purchase it and get it painted. Please let me know what you think in the comments. I had loads of fun doing this. I don't often paint Warhammer 40k for myself. I do for commissions. I paint an awful lot of Horus Heresy. And I love Warhammer 40,000 lore. And I've recently read some Warhammer 40,000 lore that's maybe inspired a very small project of which this is part of. So if you're interested in seeing more of a small Imperial Guard stroke Astra Militarum force with a couple of tutorials along the way, then please do stay tuned to the channel. And if you're not already subscribed, maybe it's a good opportunity to do so. And if you are new to the channel, please take a look at the other videos. There are a couple of other Warhammer 40k tutorials on there, but loads of other stuff as well. Lots of Warhammer the Old World and many other game systems, including historical things. Loads and loads of tutorials and quite a lot of chatter as well. And if you'd like to get involved with or support the channel further, then liking and commenting and subscribing and all of that usual stuff. I have a really friendly Discord for chat about miniatures and painting for all different game systems for the channel. And I also have a Patreon as well, as many different tiers on, links in the video description, so have a little look at those. But thank you very much to all my existing subscribers and patrons. You really keep me going and keep the lights on at the channel. Thanks very much for watching. Take care. I'll catch you soon.